The rains fell without pause, turning rivers into raging torrents of destruction. As water burst through barriers, entire neighborhoods were swallowed overnight. From the flooded wetlands, crocodiles were swept into the city without warning. Residents woke to see reptiles gliding silently through their submerged streets. Like and subscribe to discover more shocking stories where nature breaks boundaries. Panic spread as crocodiles entered homes, schools, and even busy marketplaces. Authorities warned citizens to stay indoors, but survival demanded quick action. Boats replaced cars as people tried to escape both floodwaters and predators. The city turned into a strange battleground between man and wild creatures. It was a disaster unlike anything the region had ever experienced before. 1. The rising floodwaters. The night began with heavy storm clouds gathering above the city, bringing relentless sheets of rain. Rivers swelled with force, overflowing banks, sending muddy water rushing through narrow city streets. Homes near the river felt the first touch of disaster as water seeped through doors and shattered windows. Families woke in terror, grabbing children and what belongings they could carry, fleeing to safer places. The floodwaters moved fast and silent, carrying debris, trash, and broken furniture down the trembling lanes. Market stalls were swept away in seconds as muddy currents pulled everything from fragile wooden structures. People clung to rooftops, shouting for help, their voices barely audible over the roaring, merciless flood. Electric poles bent and snapped under the water, sparking and turning the streets into dangerous rivers. Every street became a river as cars floated helplessly, overturned, and trapped by the unrelenting current. Animals from nearby farms and forests were carried along, struggling, creating more chaos for the frightened residents. The city that once felt secure now trembled under the raw power of nature, threatening life at every turn. Rescue teams launched boats into the rushing waters, but the current proved stronger than human effort. Children cried, mothers prayed, and fathers fought the rising tide to protect their families and homes. Debris struck houses repeatedly, breaking doors and windows, forcing people further into the flood's grasp. The flood pushed people from familiar streets into chaos, leaving entire neighborhoods isolated and stranded. The sky darkened with clouds and lightning, adding to the terrifying scene of unstoppable natural force. The roar of water was deafening as bridges creaked and threatened to collapse into the swirling depths. 2. First sightings of the crocodiles. As morning came, residents noticed strange shapes moving through the rushing brown water of streets. At first people thought they were debris or logs swept away by the violent flood currents. Suddenly the shapes revealed sharp eyes and scaly backs glinting under the morning sun, terrifying everyone. A woman screamed as a crocodile surfaced near a collapsed car, jaws snapping violently at the water. It became clear that the flood had carried dangerous predators into the heart of the city unexpectedly. The river's edge no longer confined them, and crocodiles swam freely through the flooded neighborhoods. Families pulled children indoors and locked doors while panic spread among every street and alley. Videos circulated quickly, showing reptiles gliding past streets and crossing bridges without hesitation. Helicopters above filmed crocodiles moving past submerged vehicles, a terrifying sight for the nation. Authorities confirmed the presence of predators, heightening fear and forcing immediate evacuations. The realization sank in that the city's normal boundaries no longer existed under the rising water. Even rescue boats were at risk as crocodiles circled silently, waiting for any sign of human movement. The streets that were once safe now belonged to wild predators and the raging floodwater combined. Citizens shivered as every ripple hinted at a crocodile lurking beneath the murky brown water. People tried shouting and banging objects to scare them, but the predators moved undeterred through currents. Families huddled together in fear, knowing the crocodiles were unpredictable and fast, striking without warning. 3. Panic in the market streets. The market district was quickly overtaken by floodwaters carrying crocodiles along narrow alleys. Vendors abandoned their goods while the reptiles knocked over carts and swam among fallen produce. Shoppers ran for safety, screaming, as crocodiles crashed through the streets with deadly precision. Once lively squares became rivers of chaos, filled with floating debris and predator-filled water. Families climbed onto rooftops or higher shelves to escape the snapping jaws below. Boats became the only mode of transportation but were attacked repeatedly by aggressive crocodiles. The smell of wet earth mixed with rotting goods and the fear of survival filled the flooded market. People desperately tried to rescue livestock, but animals were dragged away by reptiles within seconds. The market that once symbolized livelihood was transformed into a deadly swamp overnight. Every corner revealed lurking crocodiles, forcing residents to move silently or risk a sudden attack. Shop walls collapsed under pressure, allowing crocodiles to enter spaces once thought secure. Children were warned not to play near the water, but every street now hid predators beneath currents. Rescue teams navigated carefully, aware that a single mistake could cost lives instantly. The current carried broken furniture and shop signage, turning streets into obstacle-filled hunting grounds. People climbed trees and poles, unable to cross open streets filled with snapping crocodiles. 4. Schools underwater. Floodwaters reached schools, trapping children and staff in buildings that were never designed for such disaster. Desks floated, books soaked, and classrooms filled with water while crocodiles patrolled nearby corridors. Teachers struggled to calm terrified students while barricading doors against any chance of intrusion. Parents arrived to rooftops shouting for their children, but floodwaters prevented safe rescue. Children pressed against windows, watching crocodiles glide past playgrounds and hallways with cold precision. Rescue boats could not navigate safely through crowded school zones due to fast currents and reptiles. Every hall became a dangerous channel, forcing students and teachers to improvise safe spaces. Furniture was pushed to block entrances as crocodiles tested barriers and searched for openings. The sound of children crying mixed with distant hissing created an atmosphere of pure terror. Teachers and volunteers worked tirelessly to lift children to higher floors and rooftops for safety. The flood had turned schools from centers of learning into islands of survival in predator-filled waters. Some children were stranded for hours, waiting for rescuers while crocodiles circled silently outside. Water continued to rise, carrying debris that struck walls and created secondary dangers for those trapped. The normally cheerful playgrounds became submerged channels where reptiles could move freely. 5. Hospitals in danger. Hospitals were quickly engulfed as floodwaters entered treatment areas, leaving patients trapped. Beds floated helplessly as medical staff attempted to move patients to higher floors or safe rooftops. Crocodiles entered entrances, swimming through corridors searching for movement or food. Doctors worked with portable lights as power failed, performing critical procedures under extreme conditions. Emergency supplies floated away with the current, leaving staff struggling to maintain basic care. Nurses waded through waist-deep water to carry fragile patients, dodging snapping predators at every step. Visitors who remained were evacuated quickly while animals and debris created additional hazards. Some hospital wings were completely submerged, forcing staff to consolidate patients into smaller, safe areas. Crocodiles tested windows and doors, finding gaps to enter, adding terror to an already impossible situation. The flood and predators combined to turn a place of healing into a battlefield of survival against nature. Helicopters hovered overhead, rescuing patients while trying to avoid crocodiles floating dangerously below. Staff coordination became critical, using ropes, rafts, and improvised equipment to move patients safely. 6. Nightfall of terror. As darkness fell, the city was swallowed by shadows and the roar of floodwaters became louder. Crocodiles moved freely under the cover of night, their eyes glowing with predatory intent in the water. Families huddled on rooftops and attics, clutching children while listening to splashes and distant hisses. Every alley, street, and courtyard became a dangerous channel, forcing people to remain completely still. Some brave souls attempted to navigate the waters in boats, only to be struck by crocodiles lurking below. The night air was heavy with humidity, the smell of wet earth, and the tension of survival pressing down. Dogs barked and howled, warning owners of approaching predators, yet their cries could not stop the danger. Candlelight flickered in homes, providing minimal visibility but attracting curious crocodiles in the waters. The city skyline reflected in the floodwater looked eerie, shadows of buildings stretching across predator-filled streets. Families whispered prayers, trying to keep spirits alive while avoiding the attention of the hungry reptiles. Some residents used loud noises to scare crocodiles away, but their movements were silent and cunning. The floodwaters seemed endless, the night eternal, as survival became a test of courage and endurance. People feared that the first misstep could cost lives, the line between safety and danger disappearing completely. The storm raged on, thunder masking the movement of the predators, leaving humans blind to approaching threats. Helicopters circled overhead, but heavy winds and rain reduced their ability to perform rescues effectively. 7. Sacred spaces. Inundated temples, mosques, and churches were not spared as floodwaters carried crocodiles into sacred grounds. Worshippers fled mid-prayer, watching in horror as reptiles slid into courtyards and holy areas. Religious artifacts and offerings floated away, leaving a scene of destruction and disbelief among devotees. Priests and religious leaders attempted to calm congregations, but fear overwhelmed all sense of security. The floodwaters turned peaceful sanctuaries into hunting grounds, where predators moved without restraint. Crocodiles rested on flooded floors, submerged altars, and platforms once used for devotion and prayer. Families climbed towers and rooftops to escape, their sacred spaces no longer safe from nature's fury. Floodwaters carried debris and religious items, mixing with the predator-filled currents to create chaos. The faithful watched helplessly as the waters took control, realizing that no human or spiritual barrier could protect them. Children and elders alike were trapped in flooded sanctuaries, awaiting rescue while reptiles circled below. The sound of water rushing and crocodile splashes replaced chanting, echoing through abandoned halls. Some worshippers tried to block doors with benches and furniture, but the flood relentlessly pushed inside. Volunteers attempted to move the vulnerable to higher floors while predators lingered in submerged corridors. The sacred grounds that once symbolized peace now reflected the terrifying power of water and wildlife combined. People took refuge on higher steps and rooftops, praying that divine intervention would bring rescue. Even animals in temple grounds sought shelter, only to be swept away by the swirling predator-filled floodwaters. The flood demonstrated that no place, not even holy or sacred, was immune to nature's unstoppable force. 8. Bridges turned dangerous. Bridges that were once safe passages became deadly as crocodiles gathered beneath the rushing waters. Refugees attempting to cross were forced to hold onto ropes or precarious beams, fearing predator attacks. The flood weakened structures, causing some bridges to collapse under the combined pressure of water and panic. Every crossing was a calculated risk, with crocodiles waiting silently beneath for anyone who slipped or fell. The current swept away vehicles, making even boats hazardous as reptiles collided with floating debris. Helicopters monitored crossings, warning people, but strong winds and heavy rain complicated rescue efforts. Families clung together as they inched across narrow walkways, avoiding sudden movements that could attract attention. The roar of water beneath was constant, and the shadows of crocodiles added a deadly layer of uncertainty. Children were guided across bridges by parents, their small hands shaking as they stepped on slippery planks. Even emergency responders had to calculate every move, as a single misstep could result in a fatal encounter. Bridges became more than obstacles, they were traps testing human courage and strategy against natural predators. Debris from destroyed buildings floated beneath, adding obstacles that crocodiles used to approach silently. Streetlights were submerged or broken, leaving crossings in near total darkness where predators lurked unseen. People prayed quietly while balancing across beams, their focus absolute as they avoided crocodiles below. The flood forced humans to adapt quickly, using ropes, ladders, and makeshift rafts to survive. Every bridge crossing felt like navigating a predator-filled river in the heart of a disaster zone. Those who survived the bridges shared stories of near misses with snapping jaws and floating wreckage. 9. Subway tunnels flooded. Subway tunnels that were normally crowded became death traps as water surged through underground passages. Passengers trapped in trains watched in terror as crocodiles swam past doors and windows in murky water. Electric lights flickered before failing completely, leaving total darkness and the sound of water and hisses. Families climbed on seats and ceilings, trying to avoid the teeth of predators circling below. Emergency exits were blocked or submerged, making escape nearly impossible for those trapped inside. Train cars floated helplessly in rising waters, turning confined spaces into predator-filled corridors. Some survivors used emergency ladders and ropes to reach ventilation shafts while crocodiles waited below. Communication with authorities was limited, heightening fear as people realized help could be delayed. The tunnels were eerily silent except for the occasional splash, each one signaling a predator nearby. Rescue teams hesitated to enter the submerged tunnels, fearing both collapse and crocodile attacks. Even experienced responders admitted the subway had become a deadly maze with predators moving freely. Children clung to parents, whispering prayers as water levels rose with every passing moment. The flood transformed the underground into an unlit river, testing human endurance and courage simultaneously. Every step inside was calculated, every sound analyzed to avoid drawing the attention of crocodiles. Those who survived the tunnels faced trauma, their escape story spreading across the city in shock. Crocodiles used the confined space to their advantage, moving swiftly and silently through floodwaters. 10. The city center besieged. The city center, normally alive with activity, was transformed into a predator-controlled swamp by floodwaters. Crocodiles moved freely among submerged streets, climbing over vehicles and debris with terrifying strength. People trapped in office buildings and shops watched helplessly as the streets filled with snapping jaws. Floodwaters turned fountains, plazas, and squares into flowing channels for predators to roam unchecked. Traffic signals and signage floated away, creating chaotic rivers full of obstacles and lurking crocodiles. Families waved from windows, hoping rescuers could reach them while avoiding the deadly waters below. Banks, stores, and offices lost all functionality as crocodiles claimed the streets and courtyards entirely. Vehicles were overturned and pushed into walls, forming temporary islands that crocodiles explored for prey. Even government buildings could not remain isolated, with floodwaters blocking roads and leaving entrances vulnerable. The heart of the city was no longer human territory, the predators ruled with absolute freedom. Pedestrians that attempted to escape were forced to climb roofs, scaffolding, and trees to survive. Floodwaters reflected the city lights eerily, turning streets into rivers that seemed alive with danger. Every splash, ripple, or wave indicated the presence of a crocodile waiting silently to strike. Emergency crews coordinated carefully, but the combination of flood and predators slowed all progress. 11. Residential areas overrun. Neighborhoods once peaceful became dangerous zones as floodwaters carried crocodiles into every lane. Families trapped on rooftops watched helplessly as the reptiles swam past garden fences and parked cars. Children clung to parents as the water rose higher, sweeping away small pets and household items. Streets that once held laughter now echoed with splashes and hisses from predators moving silently below. Residents improvised rafts from floating doors, crates, and debris, trying to navigate through predator-filled waters. Bridges and cul-de-sacs became death traps as crocodiles patrolled the currents without hesitation. Electric poles sparked in water, adding another layer of danger to already terrifying streets. People shouted to alert neighbors, but the flood spread chaos too quickly for anyone to respond in time. Cars, motorcycles, and bicycles were overturned, turning the streets into obstacle-filled rivers for escape. 12. The flooded highways connecting different parts of the city were submerged, becoming fast-moving rivers filled with danger. Vehicles floated uncontrollably as crocodiles navigated the deep water, snapping at anything moving nearby. Drivers abandoned their cars, climbing onto rooftops or overpasses to escape the deadly currents. Emergency crews could not reach stranded commuters due to the combined threat of flood and reptiles. Signage, traffic lights, and barriers were carried away by the force of water, leaving highways unrecognizable. The flood had turned transportation arteries into predator-filled mazes, testing human courage and survival. Families trapped in buses or vans held children tight, praying for rescue while crocodiles circled in the water. Some attempted to swim to safety, only to be pulled back by the strength of the current or the presence of predators. The highway bridges shook under the pressure of rushing water and floating debris, threatening collapse. Helicopters attempted air rescues, but strong winds and rain limited their operations significantly. The flood transformed the highways into unpredictable landscapes, where every turn could hide a lurking predator. People improvised rafts from broken furniture and doors, navigating cautiously through the predator-filled waters. Rescue teams coordinated rope lines and pulleys to guide stranded citizens to safer areas above water. Families waited anxiously for help, knowing that moving without caution could attract predators immediately. The water's depth and speed, combined with crocodile attacks, made every rescue a test of skill and patience. As dawn approached, survivors began to emerge, shaken and exhausted from nights spent battling flood and predators. The highways had become unforgettable corridors of survival where human endurance met nature's fury. 13. Crocodiles in parks and recreational areas. City parks, playgrounds, and recreational spaces became flooded hunting grounds for the released predators. Children's swings and slides were submerged, creating floating islands where crocodiles could easily navigate. People trapped in these areas climbed trees and benches, trying to stay above water and avoid snapping jaws. Lakes and ponds overflowed, mixing with streets to create continuous rivers of muddy water and danger. Pet owners tried to rescue animals, only to watch in horror as crocodiles attacked helpless creatures nearby. Jogging paths and sports courts disappeared beneath floodwaters, leaving open channels for predator movement. Families picnicking in safer spots were forced to evacuate, navigating through streets filled with crocodiles. Playgrounds that once held laughter now echoed with screams and splashes from fleeing residents. Recreational benches, trash cans, and small trees floated in the currents, adding hazards to those trying to escape. Floodwaters carried debris and crocodiles together, creating unpredictable and deadly currents throughout the parks. Parents clung to children as they crossed small bridges or makeshift rafts to escape predator-filled waters. Local authorities warned everyone to avoid the parks, but some areas were already impossible to reach safely. 14. Commercial district devastation. Business districts suffered enormous destruction as floodwaters carried crocodiles among buildings and offices. Shops, restaurants, and banks were submerged, leaving floating debris and predators roaming the streets. Employees abandoned offices and stores as crocodiles appeared, turning streets into hunting channels. Glass windows shattered under water pressure, allowing reptiles to enter formerly secure buildings. Delivery vehicles and trucks floated uncontrollably, becoming obstacles in the predator-filled water. Commercial signs, awnings, and streetlights were ripped away and carried downstream, adding hazards. Business owners risked their lives trying to retrieve items but were stopped by the presence of crocodiles. Flooded sidewalks became invisible rivers, with crocodiles navigating easily between submerged buildings. Some high-rise offices remained partially dry, but the streets below belonged entirely to predators. Emergency teams rescued stranded staff from rooftops, navigating through debris and snapping jaws below. Water currents tore through narrow alleys, allowing crocodiles to move freely between business blocks. Commercial districts were paralyzed, with no safe access for employees, customers, or emergency vehicles. 15. Residential rooftop refuge. With streets submerged, residents climbed onto rooftops to avoid crocodiles in the flood below. Families stacked furniture and debris to create higher platforms for children and the elderly. Neighbors helped each other, forming human chains and rafts to reach safer rooftops nearby. Crocodiles circled below, testing for weaknesses and waiting silently for any sign of movement. The flood had created a city of islands, where every roof became a temporary sanctuary. People rationed food and water carefully, knowing rescue could be delayed by both water and predators. Children were kept calm through games and quiet stories while parents monitored the lurking danger. Helicopters hovered above rooftops, guiding rescue teams and sometimes dropping supplies into safe zones. The floodwaters carried away fences and gates, forcing residents to remain alert 24 hours a day. Some rooftops were connected by floating debris, allowing careful movement without entering predator-filled streets. Families shared resources and coordinated signals to warn each other of crocodiles approaching the waters below. Every passing minute brought anxiety, as the flood and predators showed no mercy or pause. The city's skyline reflected rooftops dotted with survivors, resembling small islands in a dangerous river. Residents prayed quietly, knowing that even small splashes in the water could signal imminent danger. 16. Industrial zone. Havoc. Factories and warehouses in the industrial district were inundated by floodwaters teeming with crocodiles. Heavy machinery floated uncontrollably, posing hazards to rescuers and stranded workers alike. Crocodiles navigated through submerged loading docks, storage yards, and alleyways with lethal ease. Workers trapped inside climbed to mezzanines and rooftops, watching debris and predators drift past. Electricity failures added darkness to already hazardous conditions, complicating rescue operations. Some industrial chemicals floated away or reacted with water, adding toxic dangers to an already deadly scenario. Rescue boats had to maneuver carefully around floating machinery to avoid attracting crocodiles. Noise from equipment clashing in the water sometimes drew attention from predators lurking below. Warehouse doors and gates were torn away by the flood, providing easy access for the hunting reptiles. Employees helped each other climb to safer levels, improvising ladders and rafts from debris. Factories with large tanks and containers became obstacles as crocodiles patrolled submerged corridors. The floodwaters converted industrial areas into mazes of debris, predators, and fast-moving water channels. Workers remained alert, avoiding splashes and sudden movements that could provoke crocodiles. Heavy rain and wind complicated helicopter rescue operations, slowing relief and evacuation efforts. The industrial zone symbolized both economic and human vulnerability during the predator-filled flood. 17. Transportation collapse. The city's transportation network collapsed as streets, highways, and rails were engulfed in water and predators. Buses, taxis, and private vehicles floated uncontrollably, blocking escape routes and creating dangerous obstacles. Trains were trapped in partially submerged stations, forcing passengers to climb to roofs to avoid crocodiles. Emergency services faced delays as crocodiles patrolled flooded streets, preventing safe access to affected areas. Bridges and tunnels were compromised, requiring improvised rafts, ropes, and coordination for rescue operations. Crocodiles moved seamlessly through submerged underpasses and roadways, making navigation treacherous. People abandoned vehicles mid-route, climbing onto debris or elevated structures to escape snapping jaws. Traffic signals and signs were submerged or carried away, leaving streets unrecognizable and highly dangerous. Public transportation systems were paralyzed, forcing residents to improvise dangerous survival strategies. Rescue teams coordinated aerial operations, but water, debris, and predators slowed every effort significantly. The collapse emphasized the vulnerability of urban infrastructure under extreme flood and wildlife threats. Families relied on community networks to move safely through flooded and crocodile-infested areas. Every flooded street became a river of uncertainty, where miscalculations could result in immediate danger. Floating obstacles such as vehicles, trees, and furniture added further hazards to both humans and rescuers. Communication failures made coordinated transport nearly impossible, increasing the risk for stranded people. 18. Power grid failure. The floodwaters submerged power lines, transformers, and substations, leaving much of the city in darkness. Crocodiles patrolled streets with glowing eyes reflecting off puddles, adding fear to powerless neighborhoods. Electric poles toppled into water, creating sparks and dangerous hazards for people and rescue teams alike. Homes, offices, and hospitals struggled to maintain basic functions without electricity while predators roamed freely. Generators failed or were inaccessible due to floodwaters, forcing reliance on flashlights and candles. Every movement in water or shadows became more frightening without electric lighting to reveal lurking dangers. Emergency services had to coordinate using radios and signals while crocodiles navigated streets below. People used rooftops and high ground to stay safe, balancing between darkness, predators, and isolation. Floodwaters turned once familiar streets into unfamiliar landscapes full of floating debris and dangerous wildlife. The combination of predator presence and darkness increased panic, stress, and risk of injury for all residents. Families stayed together, rationing supplies, and improvising ways to signal for help without attracting predators. Crocodiles used submerged obstacles and darkness to approach undetected, testing human vigilance constantly. The flood's destruction of the power grid left residents vulnerable to multiple threats at once, compounding danger. Communication became more difficult, slowing rescue and creating confusion in navigating the predator-filled streets. Temporary shelters relied on manual lighting and protection from crocodiles, making survival challenging. 19. The riverbank breach. Riverbanks that contained the city's natural waterways were breached, letting crocodiles spill into streets freely. Homes along the river were immediately submerged, forcing residents onto rooftops to escape rising water. Crocodiles moved into newly accessible streets, alleys, and residential blocks, hunting instinctively and silently. Families witnessed the destruction of fences, gardens, and walls that had once protected them from wildlife. Floodwaters carried logs, vehicles, and debris, creating chaotic currents that crocodiles exploited skillfully. Emergency teams attempted rescue but were slowed by the strength of the currents and presence of predators. People clung to whatever high ground was available, knowing that even shallow water could conceal crocodiles. The breach showed the city's vulnerability to natural barriers failing during extreme weather events. Children were terrified, holding on to parents while watching the reptiles glide past doorways and fences. Animals from farms and pets were carried into streets, where crocodiles hunted them with deadly efficiency. Rivers that had been sources of life became dangerous highways for predators moving into urban areas. Floodwaters continued to rise, making human evacuation increasingly difficult and risky under predator pressure. Residents improvised makeshift bridges and rafts, navigating between flooded homes and streets carefully. The breach widened with each hour of rainfall, letting even more predators enter and multiply the chaos. People relied on community coordination, alerting neighbors to crocodile movements and escape routes. By nightfall, the city was effectively under siege, with water and crocodiles controlling every accessible path. 20. Survival and aftermath. As floodwaters receded, residents emerged from rooftops and high ground to assess the devastation. Crocodiles retreated back to rivers and remaining deep water channels, leaving streets filled with debris. Homes, vehicles, and public spaces were destroyed or heavily damaged, creating a landscape of ruin. Families reunited, counting survivors and mourning those lost to both flood and predators during the crisis. Rescue operations shifted to recovery, clearing debris, and ensuring that no crocodiles remained in accessible areas. Local authorities began rebuilding infrastructure, focusing on flood defenses and wildlife management strategies. Psychological trauma affected survivors, especially children who witnessed predators moving through familiar streets. Community support and relief efforts were organized, distributing food, water, and medical supplies to affected areas. Lessons were learned about the need for emergency planning that accounted for both extreme flooding and wildlife intrusion. Neighborhoods worked together to repair homes, fences, and riverbanks to prevent similar disasters in the future. Volunteers documented damage and predator sightings to help scientists understand crocodile behavior during floods. Education programs were launched to teach citizens how to survive predator-filled flood situations safely. Flood insurance and disaster preparedness plans were updated based on experiences from this catastrophic event. The city slowly returned to activity, but caution remained as residents knew predators could return if conditions worsened. Infrastructure like bridges, highways, and electrical systems were reinforced to resist future floods and intrusions. Community resilience became a key focus, with drills and simulations preparing for combined natural and predator threats. Each corner carried fear, for no one knew where the reptiles would appear next. Scientists later revealed the flood had disrupted ancient reptile habitats. For locals, the night remained a reminder of nature's unpredictable force. Like and subscribe for more real stories where survival hangs by a thread. Comment below if you think cities are truly prepared for nature's fury. The crocodiles eventually returned to the swamps, but the scars remained. The event changed how people lived near rivers and wetlands forever. Nature showed its dominance in the most terrifying way imaginable. Thanks for watching.